Hi guys, welcome to Simply JavaScript. My name is Henry Zhou. Today, we'll be covering what currying is and partial functions. We'll briefly discuss currying, but mostly are going to talk about how to implement partial functions. So what is currying? According to Wikipedia, currying is basically a technique that converts a function which takes multiple parameters into multiple function calls. So let's kind of demonstrate what that means. Imagine if you have a function, call me, which takes parameter 1, 2, and 3, or any number of parameters. The way that we call this function in JavaScript is call me, you have to pass in all 3 parameters. Any parameter you don't pass in are considered as undefined. So what does currying do? When a function is curried, what essentially it allows you to do is to pass in a function in any number of parameters until all 3 params are passed in. So let's take a look at first example. We call me, and then we're calling with 1 and 2. So right now we still only have 2 parameters out of the 3. So the next time we invoke it with the 3rd parameter, this function will get evaluated. In this case, we have just the first parameter, and then if we call this again using a second param, this will get evaluated. We can also do something like this. So you can call it once, and then call it with second parameter, and then call it again with third parameter. And when all 3 parameters are passed in, that's when the function is satisfied and gets invoked. And then let's take a look at the last one. So technically, what you can do is you can call this as many times as you want without any parameters. So the first few calls are basically no ops. And then when you call the last time with all 3 parameters, that's when it gets evaluated. So currying isn't really used too much in JavaScript. Mostly because, think about it. JavaScript is very common to define parameters, but you don't pass in one or more of these parameters. So the idea is that, okay, if I don't pass the last one, treat it like it's undefined. And that's a very common pattern. So we're not going to talk about currying too much. What we're going to talk about is really partial. Partial is a variant of currying. So if you take a look at this example, the first time we call it in using partial form, it will return a function. And regardless of how many parameters you pass the second time, this function will get evaluated. So partial is essentially a to-call function, or to-call currying. Whereas currying can be called as many times as you want. For partials, the second call will always evaluate it. So in this case, if you call me twice in currying, it doesn't do anything. But in partial, this will get evaluated. Let's take a look at an example. So imagine that we have this update field. And it does some logic, but for the sake of this exercise, all we are going to do is just output field and value. So imagine something like, in a form, you have first name, last name, email, and tons of other fields. So what we're doing is when the first name is changed, we want to call this update first name function, and then when the last name is changed, we call this update last name, and then update email, so on and so forth. Imagine if you have 20 fields, you have a lot of these functions. So what do these functions look like? Let's take a look. So, we have a very generic function, which can be external. In React or Redux, this could be part of the action. It could live in a different file, a different module, and then for the sake of this exercise, we're kind of implementing it here to demonstrate what it looks like. So update first name, all it does is just simply takes the value, and we know what the field is. The field is always first name. Update last name, everything's the same, just the last name. Email, so on and so forth. if we call this update first name, we're getting this first name John, last name Smith, and email blah blah blah. We could simplify this. This kind of is very ES5 and is not as concise as it can be. We could replace these guys with arrow functions. So these are functionally equivalent, but we are doing this exactly same thing with 3 lines of code. We have this function, a higher order function. And what is a higher order function? A higher order function is essentially a function that returns a function. So what we need to do is essentially do something like callback.bind, but we don't pass it any context. What we're doing is pass it the parameters from the original call. And this is a very simple implementation of partial. So we have partial update first name. And all we're doing is saying, okay, use this partial, pre-populate my update field with first name. Now we have a very generic function. Partial can work with any function. We don't have to do something like this, which is very specific to the function you're trying to populate. So if you take a look at this, right? Update first name, John, it's the same as partial update first name. So in the case of this input, we could use something like implement the function. Alternatively, we could do something like this. Technically, we don't even need to create another variable to store the function. It's really just we can do it inline. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching.